Hello everyone, welcome to this incredible true survival story. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most harrowing tales ever told at sea, a story about desperation, morality, and what people will do when pushed beyond all limits. If you love gripping real-life adventures that make you question what you would do in impossible situations, then you're in the right place. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next parts of this extraordinary saga. Imagine you're stranded in the middle of a vast ocean. No food, no fresh water, no rescue in sight. The days drag on, and the line between survival and madness grows thinner by the hour. Now, imagine the only way to stay alive is by crossing a boundary no one should ever cross. Eating your own. A friend, this isn't fiction. It's a true story from 1884, when a small group of sailors faced exactly this unimaginable horror. On May 19th, 1884, the yacht Mignonette set sail from Southampton, England, bound for Sydney, Australia. It was a modest vessel, only 52 feet long, purchased by an Australian to deliver it to its new owner on the other side of the world. The crew was small but experienced. Captain Thomas Dudley, a seasoned sailor of 31. First mate Edwin Stevens, seasoned seaman Ned Brooks, and a 17-year-old apprentice named Richard Parker, who had some experience sailing near the coast. The first weeks of their voyage were calm. The ship sailed steadily southward, cutting through the waves under clear skies. The men shared stories, watched the endless horizon, and took turns at the wheel. But as they ventured farther into the vast and unpredictable Southern Ocean, disaster was looming. A fierce storm struck, with waves towering higher than the ship itself. The wind howled like a wild beast, threatening to tear the sails to shreds. The crew battled to keep the vessel afloat, but the storm was relentless. Eventually, the Mignonette was overwhelmed by the monstrous sea, and it began to sink. In the chaos, the four men managed to scramble aboard a small lifeboat, a mere 13-foot craft meant only for emergencies. So began their fight for survival on the open ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest land. The lifeboat was cramped, offering little shelter from the elements. The men had no fresh water, no food, and only a thin sail to catch the wind. Days turned into weeks. The sun burned down relentlessly during the day, and freezing cold settled in at night. The men grew weaker with every passing hour. Their mouths were parched, their stomachs hollow and aching. The ocean around them was vast and empty, a blue desert with no promise of rescue. They rationed what little rainwater they could collect, but it was never enough. Tensions began to rise. The strain of starvation and thirst weighed heavily on their minds and bodies. They spoke less and less, eyes darting nervously with every shadow. Slowly, hope began to fade, replaced by a creeping dread that none of them could escape. Then, one by one, the men began to fall ill. The sea was claiming its victims. After nearly 2 weeks adrift, Ned Brooks was the first to die. His body was left in the cramped lifeboat, the men too weak to bury or properly mourn him. The air grew thick with silence and fear. What would they do next? Could they survive much longer without food or water? The situation was growing desperate. Faced with starvation, the men were confronted with an unthinkable choice. As days passed and the will to live battled with moral boundaries, the harsh reality set in. They would have to resort to cannibalism if they wanted to survive. It was a decision that would haunt them forever, one that forced them to confront the darkest parts of human nature. This is just the beginning of a journey into desperation, survival, and the limits of humanity. Stay with me, because the story of the Mignonette's crew is far from over. What happened next will challenge everything. You think you know about survival and morality. The morning after Ned Brooks' death, the small lifeboat felt heavier, not just from the loss of one of their own, but from the crushing weight of despair that settled over the remaining men. Captain Thomas Dudley, First Mate Edwin Stevens, and young Richard Parker stared out at the endless expanse of ocean surrounding them. The horizon offered no salvation, just an unforgiving sea and sky that seemed to stretch on forever. Water was their most immediate concern. Though they had managed to collect some rainwater in the early days, the supply had run dangerously low. The salty sea spray coated their cracked lips and stung their parched throats, offering no relief. Every drop of moisture was precious, every moment without it unbearable. They took turns dipping their cups into the briny sea, tasting salt but swallowing out of sheer desperation. Starvation was the next looming threat. The lifeboat carried no provisions, save for a small tin of turnips, which was long gone. The men's bodies weakened rapidly, their faces gaunt and sunken, their hands trembling. They were reduced to little more than shadows of the strong sailors who had boarded the Mignonette weeks earlier. The psychological toll was just as severe. Tensions simmered beneath the surface as exhaustion and hunger warred with their sanity. The men spoke less and less, their conversations fading into heavy silence punctuated only by the slapping of waves against the lifeboat's sides. Every creak of wood and whistle of wind seemed amplified in the stillness, as if the sea itself was bearing witness to their suffering. Captain Dudley, the de facto leader, tried to keep spirits alive, offering words of encouragement and maintaining their navigation efforts as best he could, but even his resolve faltered as days without rescue stretched into weeks. He looked to the horizon each morning, hoping for a ship or island, anything to end their nightmare. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Dudley gathered the men for a grim conversation. They were facing a choice that no human should ever have to consider: to risk their morals and eat the body of their deceased comrade, or to face certain death themselves. The desperation in their eyes was palpable. They were trapped between survival and humanity. At first, none spoke. The idea was too horrid to voice aloud. But as the cold night deepened, the unbearable hunger gnawed at their willpower. The young Richard Parker, barely more than a boy, broke the silence with a whisper. "If we don't eat, we'll die. We have no choice." The words hung in the air like a curse. Dudley and Stevens exchanged looks, knowing that the line between life and death was razor thin. They all understood that this act would stain them forever, yet the will to live burned brighter than their shame. Slowly, the men prepared the body of Ned Brooks. Their hands trembled, hearts heavy with grief and guilt. What they did next was unthinkable, a desperate act born from pure survival instinct. They ate. It was a grim feast that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. Days passed. The ocean remained merciless and silent. The men's bodies were sustained by the horrific choice they had made, but their minds began to fray. Fear, guilt, and hunger twisted together in their thoughts, making every sunrise a test of endurance. Then came the moment when they had to decide who might be next. Would someone else die? Would they be forced again to choose between life and the unthinkable? The fragile thread that held them together was about to snap. The story of the Mignonette's crew is a tragic, brutal testament to the extremes of human survival. What began as a hopeful voyage had become a nightmare where morality and instinct collided in the most harrowing ways imaginable. Stay with me for the next chapter, where the struggle for survival turns even darker, and the true test of humanity unfolds in the endless, unforgiving sea. As the days dragged on, the sun blazed mercilessly overhead, turning the tiny lifeboat into a floating oven. The ocean stretched endlessly around them, a vast, indifferent expanse of blue that swallowed their hopes and dreams. Captain Dudley, Stevens and young Richard Parker fought to keep their minds intact, but with each passing hour, their bodies grew weaker and their spirits more fragile. The initial shock of their grim decision, the act that would forever haunt their memories, had passed, but the consequences weighed heavily on all of them. The simple act of survival had forced them to cross a line that no one imagined they would ever approach. Yet now, it was the only thing standing between life and death. Their rations had long since disappeared, and the meager sustenance they extracted from Ned Brooke's body was dwindling fast. Their hunger gnawed at them relentlessly, sharper than any pain they had known. Richard Parker, the youngest of the three, was especially vulnerable. His youthful frame was wasting away, and his face was etched with a mixture of fear and resignation. Dudley and Stevens did their best to keep Richard's hope alive, but inside they too were slipping toward despair. Every night, the sound of the waves seemed to echo the silence inside their minds, a haunting reminder of how alone they were in the vast ocean. Then came the turning point. A storm was brewing on the horizon, dark clouds rolling in like an angry tide. The sea, which had seemed almost static for days, began to churn violently. Winds picked up, whipping their scant clothing against their skin, and the lifeboat was tossed like a toy in the growing tempest. In the chaos, Dudley's leadership was tested like never before. He barked orders, trying to keep the sails steady, to keep the small craft afloat. But nature was indifferent to human will, and the storm roared louder, threatening to engulf them. The night that followed was a blur of crashing waves, howling winds, and desperate prayers. Each man clung to the boat and to the hope that the dawn would bring rescue. But the sea had other plans. When the storm finally passed, the damage was clear. Their fragile vessel was battered and taking on water. Exhausted beyond measure, they bailed what they could, but the damage was severe. They had survived the storm, but at what cost? As they drifted on, the looming question hung in the air. How much longer could they endure? Their bodies were frail, their minds frayed. Every sunrise was a reminder of the fragile thread they clung to between life and oblivion. But even in the face of despair, there were moments of humanity that shone through. Dudley tried to keep a routine, keeping the men occupied by taking stock of their meager supplies and scanning the horizon. Stevens, despite his own exhaustion, tended to Richard Parker, offering comfort where he could. Their camaraderie, fragile as it was, became their lifeline. In a world that had become cold and indifferent, the bond between these men was their only warmth. Yet the ocean was vast, and rescue seemed as distant as the stars above. This chapter of their ordeal was a grim reminder that survival was not just about fighting nature, but also about confronting the darkest depths of the human soul. Stay tuned as the story unfolds further. What happens when desperation pushes men beyond all limits? The journey is far from over. The days after the storm were some of the hardest they had faced. Their small lifeboat, battered and fragile, drifted helplessly on the endless ocean. The sun blazed down without mercy, turning their skin raw and cracked. The saltwater spray stung their eyes and lips, but fresh water was nearly gone. Every drop was precious, carefully collected from rain or from the canvas of their sails, and rationed sparingly between them. Dehydration crept in slowly, bringing dizziness, confusion, and weakness. Their bodies were breaking down, inch by inch. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. The last remnants of Ned Brooks' body had been consumed, but it was not enough to sustain them for long. Each meal was a grim reminder of the terrible price of survival. Their stomachs hollow and aching, their faces gaunt, the three remaining men were shadows of their former selves. The youngest, Richard Parker, was especially fragile, his youth offering no shield from the brutal reality they faced. His eyes, once full of hope and curiosity, now looked distant and haunted. Mental strain was even heavier than physical pain. The endless heat and unchanging horizon played tricks on their minds. They saw things, shapes in the waves, shadows on the sky, and heard whispers that weren't there. Sleep came in brief, broken bursts, filled with nightmares and cold sweats. The loneliness was overwhelming. Silence became their constant companion, broken only by the creaking of the boat and the lapping of the sea. Captain Dudley fought to keep the small group together, to hold on to some shred of order and purpose. Every morning he took out their compass, trying to steer them toward any hope of rescue. Every evening they scanned the horizon for ships, islands, anything. He urged Stevens and Richard to keep their spirits up, but he saw in their faces the same exhaustion and fear that gripped his own heart. They spoke little, but when they did, their voices were soft, often choked with emotion. They talked about their homes and families, the lives they had left behind. They whispered about what they would do if they survived this ordeal, though deep down they feared there would be no survivors. Those conversations were sometimes their only escape from the crushing reality around them. One afternoon, Dudley noticed that Richard was growing weaker. The boy struggled to keep his balance, his skin blistered from the sun and peeling away. His once bright eyes were dull and glassy. That evening, Richard spoke quietly, barely audible over the wind and waves. "Captain, I don't think I can hold on much longer." Dudley's heart broke. He knew the boy was close to the edge and that their time was running out. They were trapped in a vast, uncaring ocean, fighting against a fate that seemed inevitable. They realized that if one of them were to die next, the survivors might again face the unthinkable choice they had tried to avoid. In a final act of fairness, they drew lots to decide who might face death next. The lot fell on Richard Parker. The weight of that decision crushed them all, especially knowing the innocence of the boy chosen by chance. Days passed without immediate tragedy, but the shadow of that decision hung over them like a storm cloud. Every breath was heavy with dread, every glance filled with unspoken fear. Far from their desperate plight, the world went on unaware. No one knew of the terrible ordeal unfolding thousands of miles from shore. a story of survival, horror, and the limits of human endurance. Their struggle was far from over. The sea held more trials, and the choices they would face next would push them beyond all limits, testing the fragile line between life and death, humanity and survival. The ocean stretched out endlessly, a vast and merciless expanse of blue that swallowed the tiny lifeboat whole. Day after day, the three men, Dudley, Stevens, and Richard Parker, were left to battle not only the elements, but the slow, grinding erosion of their own bodies and minds. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning their skin to parchment and draining the last reserves of their strength. The salt spray stung their eyes and lips, and every breath tasted of salt and desperation. Richard Parker, the youngest, was slipping away before their eyes. His body, once full of life and energy, had become frail and gaunt. His sunburned skin peeled in sheets, revealing raw, tender flesh underneath. His movements were slow and unsteady, his once bright eyes now dull and glassy, filled with a haunted emptiness. Captain Dudley and Stevens did everything they could to keep the boy alive, sharing what little water they had, shielding him from the brutal sun, and whispering words of encouragement. But no matter their efforts, it was clear Richard was fading fast. Hunger was an ever-present torment. The taste of food was a distant memory, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that consumed their thoughts. Their stomachs ached with every passing hour, and the men found themselves haunted by dreams of fresh meals and flowing water. The struggle for survival had drained not just their bodies but their minds. Their thoughts were often clouded by delirium, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. Isolation tightened its grip like a noose. The vast, silent ocean surrounded them, unyielding and indifferent. The only sounds were the gentle lap of waves against the boat and the occasional creak of wood straining under the sun. The nights were cold and long, and sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nightmares and fear. The men found themselves talking less, each retreating into their own private hell. One day, a flicker of hope appeared. Dudley spotted a flock of seabirds, flying low and fast over the water, a rare sign that land might be near. Clinging to this slender thread of hope, they adjusted their course, following the birds' path as best they could. For hours they sailed toward the direction the birds had flown, hearts pounding with anticipation. But as the sun began to set, the hoped-for land remained elusive. No island appeared on the horizon, only more endless sea. Their spirits sank once more, crushed beneath the weight of their unyielding predicament. Despite their physical suffering and the mental torment that threatened to overwhelm them, the three men clung fiercely to a flicker of hope. It was hope that sustained them in the face of overwhelming odds, the hope that rescue might come, that this nightmare would one day end, and that the bonds they had forged in this crucible of survival might somehow endure beyond the sea. But the ocean held more trials in store. The story of these men was far from over, and the next chapters would test the very limits of human endurance and morality. The sun rose again on the fragile lifeboat, casting a pale light over the three men who remained trapped in this watery purgatory. Each new day brought the same harsh routine, but the toll on their bodies and minds was growing unbearable. Richard Parker's condition deteriorated rapidly. His once strong frame was now thin and fragile, his skin a patchwork of raw wounds and peeling burns. His breathing was shallow and uneven, and the spark of life in his eyes was dimming with every passing. Our Captain Dudley and Stevens did what they could to care for him, But their own strength was fading too. The physical strain of endless exposure to the sun, the salt, and the merciless ocean had left them weak and vulnerable. Their muscles ached, their lips were cracked and bleeding, and every movement felt like a monumental effort. The mental burden was even heavier. The desperation in their eyes was unmistakable. Each man silently wondering how much longer they could endure this hell. The hunger that gnawed at their insides was more than a physical pain. It was a constant, haunting presence. Memories of warm meals, fresh water, and the simple comfort of a dry bed tormented them relentlessly. Their minds played cruel tricks, conjuring illusions of food and rescue, only to have those visions ripped away by the cold, cruel reality of their situation. Despite their suffering, they tried to maintain a semblance of order and hope. Captain Dudley took it upon himself to keep the group focused. He reminded Stevens and Richard that survival depended not only on strength, but on willpower and unity. Every morning they checked their compass, attempting to navigate toward any hint of land or passing ships. Every evening they scanned the horizon, searching desperately for a sign of salvation. But the sea remained silent. No ships appeared, no islands emerged from the mist. The horizon was an endless, unbroken line of blue. The isolation was suffocating. The men's conversations grew quieter, their spirits more subdued. Fear and hopelessness began to seep into every corner of their minds. One afternoon, as the sun scorched the sky, a sudden storm rolled in, darkening the sea and sky with ominous clouds. The winds howled, and the waves grew monstrous, battering the fragile lifeboat. The men struggled to hold on, their bodies pushed to the brink by the violent tempest. Richard, barely conscious, clung weakly to the side of the boat, his frail grip slipping in the cold spray. The storm passed as suddenly as it had come, leaving a battered but intact lifeboat in its wake. The brief violence of nature was a stark reminder of their vulnerability. They were at the mercy of the elements, small and insignificant against the vast power of the ocean. In the eerie calm after the storm, Dudley looked at Richard's pale face and knew that time was running out. The boy's strength was nearly gone, and with it the fragile hope that had kept them alive. The men faced a grim reality. Their choices were dwindling, and the consequences of survival would become even more horrifying. The sea held no mercy, no answers, only endless questions, and the cruel test of human endurance. The sun rose once more, casting its relentless glare over the battered lifeboat adrift on the endless ocean. The waves rocked the tiny vessel with a rhythm that seemed almost mocking, a cruel lullaby for men caught between life and death. Captain Dudley, Stevens, and Richard Parker, once robust and full of life, were now gaunt, sunburned shadows of themselves, their bodies a map of the torment they had endured, cracked lips, peeling skin, swollen eyes from salt and exhaustion. The ocean was no longer just a place, but a merciless adversary, an unyielding force, testing every fiber of their being. Richard, the youngest, was fading fast. His once bright eyes, which had held the curiosity and innocence of youth, now stared blankly at the horizon, glazed with pain and confusion. He no longer spoke, except in whispered murmurs, often slipping into fits of coughing that racked his frail frame. The sun's cruel rays had roasted his skin to a mottled red and white, with deep cracks that bled salt water. The boy's weakness was a heavy weight on Dudley and Stevens, who struggled to provide what little care they could with the scarce resources at hand. Each day was a relentless battle against the sun and salt, hunger and thirst. The water ration was down to a mere fraction of what they'd started with, carefully measured and divided into drops. The men fought exhaustion and dehydration, their minds often slipping into delirium. At times, they barely distinguished between reality and hallucination. The vast ocean became a theater of nightmares, where shadows moved beneath the waves and distant cries whispered on the wind. Despite the physical toll, the mental and emotional strain was even more devastating. Loneliness, despair, and fear pressed on them like an invisible weight. The isolation was suffocating, the silence deafening. The endless horizon offered no promise, no answers, only the cold certainty of an unforgiving fate. Captain Dudley held on to the fragile threads of hope and reason, trying desperately to anchor the others to sanity. He reminded Stevens and Richard of their duty to survive, to keep fighting no matter how dark things became. But even his voice sometimes faltered, betraying the deep fear he kept locked inside. The men found themselves retreating into memories of home, family, and normal life. These recollections were bittersweet, comforting but painful reminders of everything they had lost. They spoke less, conserving energy and spirit, but when they did, their words were heavy with sorrow and longing. One afternoon, a faint glimmer on the horizon sparked a surge of hope. A ship, a speck at first, appeared. A beacon of possible salvation. The men's hearts raced. They waved frantically, shouting with what little strength they had, praying the crew would see them. But the ship altered course, drifting away without noticing their desperate signals. The crushing disappointment shattered their fragile hope and deepened the gloom that enveloped them. As hunger and dehydration tightened their grip, moral dilemmas began to surface with terrifying clarity. The terrible choice that had already scarred them haunted their waking hours and their dreams. Each man wrestled with guilt and dread, knowing that survival might demand unspeakable acts once again. Captain Dudley and Stevens faced the grim reality that Richard was slipping beyond help. The boys' frailty made the unthinkable decision loom closer. To survive, they might have to repeat what they had already done, sacrifice the weakest among them. The very thought was a dagger to their hearts, but the relentless hunger and thirst left no room for hope. The nights were the hardest. The cold air stung their sunburned skin, and the vast, dark ocean pressed down with a suffocating weight. Their dreams were plagued with visions of death and despair, haunting memories of Ned Brooks and the shadow of the fate that might await Richard. One particularly brutal night, Stevens whispered to Dudley, his voice trembling. "How much longer? Can he last? How much longer can we hold on?" Dudley's reply was barely audible. "I don't know, but we have to keep trying. For now, we survive." The next day dawned with no mercy. The sun scorched them again, and the waves tossed their lifeboat like a toy. Richard's breathing grew shallow, and he was barely conscious. Dudley and Stevens took turns holding him, trying to provide comfort with what little they had. Each moment was a battle against the inevitable. With their strength fading, they drew lots once more to decide the cruel fate of survival. The result was devastating but inevitable. Richard was again the chosen one. The men wept silently, the enormity of their situation crushing their spirits. They were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape, yet amid the horror, a flicker of resolve remained. They vowed to honor Richard's memory by surviving, by living through the nightmare and telling the story. The ocean was vast, cold and merciless, but their will to live was fierce and unbroken. The days stretched on, a blur of pain, hope, fear, and desperation. The sea held its secrets tightly, but the men clung to life, even as the world around them seemed to unravel. Their ordeal was far from over. The ocean's endless horizon held more challenges, more decisions that would test the limits of human endurance and morality. But they had one thing left: each other, fragile though it was, and the burning desire to survive against all odds. The ocean was quieter than usual that morning. A thin mist clung to the water, swallowing the horizon, hiding the sky. For the three men drifting endlessly in their weather-worn lifeboat, the silence was not peace. It was a haunting void. Every creak of the wood beneath them, every distant splash, sounded louder than it should. It was as if the sea had drawn a curtain around them, isolating them not just from the world, but from time itself. Stephen stirred first. He blinked at the pale sky, his lips cracked and swollen, his tongue thick in his mouth from thirst. He glanced over to Dudley, who sat hunched with his head bowed, staring into the sea like it might finally offer an answer, or a way out. Richard Parker lay still, barely breathing, wrapped in a scrap of damp canvas they had pulled over him to shield his ruined skin from the sun. The days had turned into a monotony of suffering. They counted time in sunrises and hallucinations. Their limbs were weak, their muscles barely responding, yet their minds remained painfully aware. That was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their survival, the clarity of their suffering. Death would have been quiet, but survival screamed no. Rescue had come. Not after the ship that vanished on the horizon, not after the storm that battered their bodies and stole their voices. They were invisible now, forgotten by the world, floating between memory and oblivion. By midday, the mist had lifted, and the sun returned with a vengeance. It scorched their salt-caked skin, turning every exposed surface into a wound. Their eyes watered involuntarily, and tears, precious water, ran down sunburned cheeks, but they didn't wipe them away. There was a strange comfort in that pain. At least it meant they were still alive. Richard moaned quietly. It was a sound so soft it might have been the breeze, but it drew both Dudley and Stevens toward him instantly. The boy's lips moved, dry and trembling, as if forming words he couldn't speak. Dudley leaned closer, pressing his ear near the boy's mouth. Mother. That was all. A whisper of a memory, maybe. Or a last hope. Dudley sat back, eyes closed. His chest ached with more than hunger. The boy had become more than a companion in this floating grave. He was a mirror of their own vulnerability, their own innocence lost at sea. He thought of his own children, of the weight of this command, of the cost of surviving. Stevens looked away. He couldn't stand to watch anymore. Instead, he peered at the horizon, looking for anything, a bird, a sail, a shadow. But the ocean was as empty as ever. Just a dull blue wall closing in. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, their thoughts grew darker, heavier. They had tried to hold on to decency, tried to remain men. But out here, on the edge of the world, what did it mean to be human anymore? The boundaries had blurred. Morality had shifted. What once seemed unthinkable had now become necessity. They hadn't spoken about it, not since the last time. Not since Ned. But the thought was there, hanging in the air like the stench of dried salt and blood. The boy was dying. He would not last another day. They knew it. He knew it. And they could not last another two. That night was windless and dead. The stars offered no comfort. The ocean was flat and black like a mirror to their souls. Dudley could not sleep. He stared at the boy, listening to his shallow breaths, each one a fragile thread tethering him to life. He whispered, "I'm sorry, Richard." There was no reply. Stephen said nothing, but his eyes, barely visible in the moonlight, were wet. Dawn came slowly, the sun rising blood orange over the edge of the world. The light fell across Parker's face. He was unconscious now, drifting somewhere beyond pain, his body still but not yet cold. The silence between Dudley and Stevens said everything. The code of the sea, the old unwritten law, hovered between them. Sailors had followed it for generations in times of great peril, when all hope was lost and starvation threatened to claim them all. One life might be given so that others could live. But this boy hadn't volunteered. He hadn't drawn a lot. There was no ceremony, no decision made in unison. There was only hunger, and the question neither of them wanted to ask out loud: if he dies, can we survive without doing what must come next? By midday it was clear. Richard Parker was gone. His chest had stopped rising. His breath, so faint before, was now absent. The canvas that had shielded him from the sun now shrouded his body in finality. The silence was unbearable. Dudley reached out, gently closed the boy's eyes, and sat beside him in silence. Stevens looked on, his hands trembling, his heart beat loudly in his ears. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. They said a prayer, a broken, stuttering thing, torn between guilt and necessity. And then they began. They had no tools, only a small blade, dull and rusted, and trembling hands. The act was brutal, quiet, surreal. There were no words, no glances exchanged, only the task. The desperate animal task of surviving. The first bite was the hardest, but it kept them alive. And when it was done, when their stomachs felt the warm, unfamiliar sensation of fullness, they cried, openly, uncontrollably, like children. The sea around them remained unchanged, the sky indifferent, but inside something had shifted forever. A part of them had been lost, not just their humanity, but perhaps their ability to ever truly return to the world they had left behind. The following days blurred together. Their strength returned slightly, just enough to keep breathing, to sit upright, to think clearly. And with that clarity came something worse than fear, guilt. Every time Dudley closed his eyes, he saw Richard's face, not in death, but in life, laughing, hopeful, trusting. A boy who had depended on them, a boy who never stood a chance. Stevens became quiet, withdrawn. He stared at the ocean for hours at a time, not speaking, barely moving. Whatever thoughts he had, he kept them buried. They didn't speak of what had happened. There were no words, only the memory, and it hung over them like a storm cloud, thick and heavy, waiting to break. But even now, in the darkest depths of their shame and horror, they clung to life. because survival, however cruel, was still survival. And the story was not yet over. The sun rose over a lifeboat that no longer drifted. It seemed to hang motionless on the surface of the sea, suspended in a kind of eternal limbo. Captain Dudley and Stevens sat in silence, separated not just by the narrow width of the boat, but by something far wider and more unspoken, the shadow of what they had done. The body of Richard Parker was gone. Over the side, given back to the sea in a solemn, quiet ritual. There had been no eulogy, no final words, just a long moment where neither man could look directly at the other. When the canvas was folded and tucked away, when the last ripple from the ocean had faded, it was as if time stopped. There were only two of them now, two men alone with their guilt. Dudley tried to organize his thoughts. He was a captain. He had always been a man of order, of structure. His world was built on rules, of seamanship, of duty, of command. But the sea didn't care for rules. It bent and broke them, reshaped them with every wave. And now, with only Stevens left, Dudley was no longer a captain. He was just another man adrift in an endless blue prison. Stevens was a different kind of quiet. His silence came from somewhere deep, a place untouched by light. Since that final act he had hardly spoken. His eyes were open, but they saw nothing. He stared toward the horizon, not searching, not hoping, just existing. Sometimes his lips moved, but no words came out. At night he shivered even when it wasn't cold. The act had kept them alive, but it had killed something else inside them. They didn't speak about it, not directly, not ever. It was there, in every glance, in every pause between their shallow conversations. It clung to their skin like salt, soaked into the wood of the lifeboat, into the grain of the oars, into the canvas sails that now hung uselessly limp in the still air. Dudley tried to take stock. Water gone, food, only what they had consumed. Hope, as faint as the starlight at night, visible but unreachable. The days grew slower. One afternoon, a cloud bank appeared far to the east. At first, they thought it might be land or smoke from a ship. Both men perked up, sat straighter, squinted with tired red eyes, but the illusion faded. Just clouds. Always clouds. Always sky and sea, and no salvation. The lifeboat creaked constantly, as if groaning under the weight of their silence. Dudley began talking to himself, not madness exactly, but a kind of compulsive monologue. It was how he kept his thoughts moving, how he kept the guilt from rotting his mind completely. He spoke to the sky sometimes to Richard, sometimes to his wife or his son. He told them he was sorry. He told them he didn't mean for this to happen. He told them that he had no other choice. Stevens said nothing. One night, a cool wind picked up. It stirred. The sails, weakly, rocked the lifeboat with a lulling motion. Dudley stared up at the stars and wondered if they were still real. The stars didn't change. They were eternal, watching from above, unblinking, unforgiving. He wondered if the stars had seen what they had done. When the wind died, the sky remained clear. Dudley traced constellations he hadn't thought about since his earliest years at sea: Orion, Cassiopeia, the Southern Cross. Once, those stars had guided him. Now, they felt like silent judges in a celestial courtroom. He turned to Stevens, who hadn't moved. "You awake?" Dudley asked quietly. A pause. Stevens nodded. Another pause. Then Dudley asked, "Do you think we'll make it?" Stevens finally spoke, and when he did, his voice was dry and hollow. "I think we already didn't." The words hung in the air, heavier than the heat. Dudley looked away. He understood exactly what Stevens meant. Whatever lives they might reclaim, if they were ever rescued, would not be the same ones they left behind. They had crossed a threshold. Survival had cost them something greater than life. Time lost meaning again. The days were no longer measured in hours, but in thirst, in silence, in the unbearable weight of remembering. Dudley tried to track the sun with the broken compass, tried to estimate their drift, their distance from the African coast, but it was futile. They could have been a mile from land, or 1,000. The ocean didn't care. One morning, a school of fish passed beneath the boat, silver darts glinting just below the surface. Stevens watched them with a kind of mournful longing. The fish were free, alive, untouched by grief or hunger or shame. Dudley thought of trying to catch one, tried reaching with the blade, cupping water, but it was useless. The fish moved like thoughts, always one step ahead, always just out of reach. Later that day, a bird landed briefly on the bow. A seabird, white, delicate, alien. It blinked once, tilted its head, then took flight again. Dudley watched it vanish into the sky. "Land can't be far," he said aloud. Stevens didn't reply. Another night passed, then another, and then, on the morning of the 24th day, Stevens woke with a sound, a distant rumble, a low, throaty engine hum. He sat up too fast, dizzy from dehydration, his hands gripping the side of the boat. Dudley jolted awake. "What is it?" Stevens raised a hand, listening, and then they saw it. A ship, small, dark against the rising sun, moving fast. Dudley's heart nearly exploded in his chest. He grabbed the torn canvas, waved it frantically. Stevens stood, wobbling dangerously, shouting hoarsely into the sky. The ship was getting closer and closer, and then it turned. It was a German vessel. A schooner. Dudley laughed or cried, maybe both. He dropped to his knees, still waving, still shouting. Stevens sat back, trembling, staring at the ship like it was a ghost. It took hours, but eventually the schooner came alongside them. Voices in German shouted from above. Ropes were tossed. Hands reached down, and then, for the first time in nearly 4 weeks, Dudley and Stevens were no longer alone. They were hauled aboard, fed water, covered in blankets. The crew, shocked by the state of them, offered quiet hospitality. There were questions. Dudley tried to answer. Some words came, some didn't. The boat, their lifeboat, was left drifting, and in it, the truth. The German schooner was not a large ship, but to Dudley and Stevens it felt like a floating cathedral. Solid beneath their feet, humming with quiet life. The sudden weight of a real deck under their bodies was almost overwhelming. More real, somehow, than their own limbs. Every plank creaked with purpose. Every voice sounded like salvation. They had been rescued. But being saved and being free are not the same thing. Dudley lay on a narrow bunk, bundled in coarse wool blankets, his body trembling from warmth and shock. The sudden shift from death's waiting room to safety was too much for his body to handle all at once. His skin burned as it thawed, every joint aching, every nerve overstimulated. He closed his eyes and felt the ship's engine vibrate. Through the floor, It was almost like a heartbeat, and he didn't trust it yet. In the bunk across from him, Stevens was curled into himself, facing the wall. He hadn't said much since they were brought aboard. His eyes were sunken, ringed with a hollowness that couldn't be filled by food or water. The cook had brought broth, rich and fragrant, but Stevens only sipped it, and when he swallowed it was slow, hesitant, like he thought he didn't deserve it. Neither of them had spoken about Richard, not to each other, not to the crew. Dudley knew that day would come. The German crew was kind but cautious. They didn't press with questions, not at first. They recognized trauma when they saw it. These two Englishmen were ghost-like, sunburned, malnourished, trembling with something deeper than cold. But curiosity simmered beneath their civility. They must have wondered, how did two men survive nearly a month at sea with no food or water? The answer hung in the air like fog. Dudley tried to focus on recovery, tried to let the act of being alive take hold, but his mind kept circling back, to the boy's face, to the moment before, the knife, the breathless silence, the sound of the waves afterward. He couldn't escape it, not even now, not even here. On the second night aboard, Dudley was woken by a noise, a gasp, a mutter. He sat up quickly, heart pounding. It was Stevens. He was thrashing in his bunk, caught in a nightmare. His limbs jerked and a low moan escaped his lips. No, I didn't mean to. Dudley rushed to his side and placed a hand on his shoulder. John, it's all right. It's just a dream. Stevens's eyes shot open, wild and unfocused. He stared straight through Dudley for several long seconds, then he turned away and curled tighter into himself. The next morning, a German officer asked them to come topside. The sea was calm, the sun bright. The captain, a tall, hard-faced man with kind eyes, greeted them with practiced politeness. "We make port in 3 days," he said. "Brazilian coast, Recife." Dudley nodded. "Thank you for saving us." The captain studied them. "Do you feel ready to speak of what happened?" Dudley hesitated. Stevens didn't respond at all. "Soon," Dudley said. "When we're ready?" The captain didn't press, but Dudley knew the questions wouldn't wait forever. By the time they reached the Brazilian port, the news had already begun to spread. A lifeboat found at sea. 2 British sailors rescued, missing for nearly a month. The world's curiosity had been piqued. Newspapers sent correspondence. The port authorities made inquiries. The first official interview was brief. Dudley gave a general account: storm damage, wreckage, 4 men in a lifeboat, eventual death by exposure. He did not mention Parker. Not yet, but the authorities knew the name. Parker's disappearance had been reported by the time the mignonette was declared overdue. The boy's family had waited months with no word. The story of the ship's last known position had circulated. In shipping circles, there was already talk of negligence, of loss, of blame. Once word reached London, the headlines followed. Missing yacht survivors found, 2 men returned from the edge of death. But what happened to the boy? Dudley and Stevens were granted passage home on a British steamer. The journey took several weeks, and for most of it they stayed confined to their cabins. Stevens barely ate. He spoke only when necessary. He read the Bible often, holding it close like a talisman. Dudley wrote letters to his wife, to the ship's owner. He drafted a statement, his version of events, honest but controlled. He omitted the details that would haunt the public. He framed it as duty, a sacrifice, but he knew deep down that framing wouldn't hold. When they disembarked in Falmouth, a crowd had gathered, reporters, dock workers, a few scattered onlookers, some curious, some already judging. There were whispers in the air. Cannibalism, they said. The boy, that poor boy. Dudley kept his head high. Stevens looked down at his feet. The authorities were waiting. They were polite but firm. There would be a full inquiry, statements, depositions, and depending on the findings, possibly a criminal trial. Dudley nodded. We expected as much. Questioning began days later. By then, the official report from the German schooner had arrived. It detailed the condition of the survivors, the absence of the boy, and the statements made in fevered sleep. Nothing explicit, but enough to ignite the spark. Under pressure, Dudley told the truth, or his version of it. He spoke calmly. He used words like necessity and fate. He referenced maritime law, the traditions of the sea. He insisted that Parker had been near death, that there was no struggle, that it had been in some way merciful. Stevens corroborated, but barely. His statement was hesitant, clouded with emotion. At times, he seemed to be apologizing to no one in particular. The newspapers tore them apart. Horror at sea, boy eaten by crew. Cannibals return to England. Is survival a justification for murder? Public opinion split. Some defended the men, sailors mostly, who understood the brutal truth of the open sea. Others condemned them outright. Mothers, priests, politicians. Everyone had an opinion. The trial was inevitable. It was the first time in modern British law that the legal system would confront the reality of survival cannibalism. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from across Europe attended. The boy's family sat in the front row. Dudley stood in the dock and recounted the story once more. But this time, his words felt heavy, final. He described the days without water, the collapse of the boy, the silence, the decision. The judge listened in silence. The jury shifted uncomfortably. When the verdict came, it was simple: guilty of murder. The courtroom exploded. Sentencing followed swiftly. Death, the judge pronounced. But the public outcry was louder than the verdict. Protests sprang up. Petitions circulated. Thousands argued that no man should be punished for surviving. Eventually, the Crown relented. The sentence was commuted. 6 months in prison, that was all. When Dudley stepped out of the prison gates half a year later, the world looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. He had survived the sea. He had survived the trial, but he was not free. He never would be. The prison gates clanged shut behind Thomas Dudley, but it was not the sound of freedom. It echoed like judgment, like a reminder. The sky outside was grey and close, pressing low as if the heavens themselves were ashamed to look him in the eye. He stepped forward slowly, his boots touching the dirt of the outside world for the first time in 6 months. No family waited for him, no crowd, no celebration, just silence. The newspapers had moved on. A new scandal, a royal engagement, a war, brewing on distant shores. There was always something else to distract the public. But for Dudley, time hadn't moved at all. He still woke with the taste of salt in his throat, still heard the boy's voice in his sleep, still saw Stevens curled in that lifeboat, whispering prayers to an empty sky. The prison had been short but brutal. Not because of the guards, they treated him with detached indifference. Not because of the cell, cramped but survivable. It was the isolation that punished him most. Solitude had been the worst part of the lifeboat, and it had followed him into every dark corner of his new life. He often wondered if it would ever leave him. He turned from the prison walls and walked slowly toward town. He didn't know where he was going. His family had moved. His wife had written once, briefly, with a tone more distant than the miles between them. His children, she said, were too young to understand. Maybe someday they'd forgive. Maybe not. Dudley found a boarding house run by an old sailor's widow. She recognized his name, but didn't say it out loud, just nodded once and led him to a small room overlooking a fog-draped harbor. The bed was hard, the window draughty, but it was quiet. He sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the wall for a long time. 3 days later, he wrote his first letter to Stevens. "John, I hope this reaches you in good health. I have heard nothing since the trial. I think of those days often, not because I want to, but because I cannot help it. There are things I wish I'd done differently, but also things I know we could not have changed. If you are willing, I would like to meet, perhaps in London, or wherever. You are now. Yours, T.D." There was no reply. He didn't try again. Instead, he tried to find work. The sea, once his life's calling, was now a closed door. No ship owner would hire him. No crew would serve under him. His name was known in every port, whispered. Behind hands, spat onto tavern floors. Murderer, they'd say. Cannibal. Monster. He applied for clerkships, for dockside work, for anything that didn't involve salt water. He told people he was a carpenter by trade, true in his youth, but the name always caught up with him. A man couldn't outrun a ghost, especially one of his own making. Months passed. Eventually he found work in a fishing village farther up the coast, under a false name. Manual labor, mostly. Cold hands, colder nights. No questions asked if the work was done. He kept to himself, slept little, spoke less. The sea was never far. He often walked the shore at night, boots sinking into the wet sand, watching the black waves roll in without end. The ocean had once been his mistress, his calling. Now it was something else, a reminder, a mirror. He started seeing Parker in dreams again, not always as he had been. Sometimes the boy stood tall, older, dressed in an officer's coat. Sometimes he was as Dudley remembered him, frail, sunburned, barely more than a boy, eyes too large for his face. But always he stared, never spoke, just stared. The dreams bled into waking life. Once, while repairing nets in a shed, Dudley looked up and saw the boy standing in the doorway. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Another time he swore he heard a voice, soft, familiar, whisper his name from the crashing surf. He began to write, not to anyone, just to purge the memory, page after page, detailing the voyage, the wreck, the lifeboat. He wrote about the thirst, the hunger, the sun, about the silence after Brooks died, about the vote, the knife. He wrote about Stevens, how the man had changed, how the sea had carved something out of him and left only the shell. He wrote about Parker, over and over. One night, while reading the Bible for the first time in years, Dudley came across the story of Abraham and Isaac. He stared at the passage for an hour. Then he closed the book gently and wept, not for himself, for the boy. For the lie he had told himself, that it had been necessary, for the truth he could no longer outrun, that he had chosen. Weeks later, a letter arrived. No return address. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. Thomas, I received your note. I could not write sooner. I have been unwell. I am living now in the country with my sister. She does not speak of it, but I know she knows. Sometimes I see him, in mirrors, in crowds, once in the eyes of my own reflection. I am not angry with you. I am simply tired. Let us not meet, but let us remember. J.S. Dudley folded the letter carefully. He placed it beneath the mattress. He didn't try again. Years passed. The case of the mignonette became a subject in law schools. Professors dissected it, debated it. Philosophers argued about moral boundaries, about ethics in desperation. But for the men who had lived it, it wasn't theory. It wasn't academic. It was a boy's name carved into the heart. Eventually, Dudley stopped working. His hands grew stiff, his back bent. He took long walks, sometimes miles along the cliffs, always stopping to look out over the endless grey. Once, a young sailor passed him and nodded politely. "Morning, sir." Dudley nodded back. The boy didn't know who he was. That night, Dudley sat by candlelight and wrote one last entry in his journal. "I have lived, I have paid, and still I carry it. There are no answers, only tides." Then he closed the book. He placed it in a drawer. The sea continued to whisper at his window. The boy's name was still spoken in his hometown, not loudly, not often, but it lived in the hush between conversations, in the way his mother set an extra plate at the table for a year after his disappearance, in the glances his father gave passing ships long after the mignonette was declared lost, in the soft way his younger siblings whispered about him at bedtime, imagining he'd washed up on a quiet island, still alive, still smiling. Richard Parker had been just 17 when he boarded that yacht. He'd lied about his age, proudly, said he wanted adventure, said he wanted to see the world. No one had questioned him. The sea, after all, had a way of pulling in the brave and the foolish alike. And Richard, with his too eager grin and wide eyes, had been both. At first his disappearance had only been a whisper, one of many losses in a summer of storms. But then came the headlines, the survivors, the trial, the truth, and suddenly everyone knew his name. The Parkers had not asked for this notoriety. They were a quiet family, working class, devout, proud in the way coastal families often are. When the details emerged, when the newspapers printed the confession, when the names of Dudley and Stevens became known, their grief turned sharp. Not just sorrow, but fury. Murder. They had called it murder, but the courts had spared the killers. His mother never forgave that. She wore black every day after the trial ended. Not for show, not to make a point, but because she said it kept the memory of her son alive. Her mourning became a part of her. She refused charity, refused interviews, refused the morbid curiosity of strangers. She simply lit a candle in the church every Sunday and said his name aloud at the altar. Richard, as if saying it could bring him back. His father grew silent, hard. The once lively man who had whistled while mending nets became stone-faced and distant. The village respected his grief, but didn't know how to touch it. He refused to speak of the trial. He never said the name of the captain or the mate. But one afternoon, alone on the harbour, he carved something into the railing of the dock with a rusted knife. "They ate my boy." The words remained there for years. Salt-worn and faded, but legible, a quiet accusation to every passing ship. Back in London, the legal ripples of the case had not settled either. Lawyers and lawmakers debated the implications of the verdict for decades. Could necessity justify killing? Was survival its own defense? The ruling that necessity was no defense to murder became precedent. It would be taught in law schools under the name R. Vis Dudley and Stevens. But Richard Parker wasn't in the textbooks. His name was rarely mentioned. He became a footnote in legal theory, a hypothetical to argue over, a ghost in the machine. But outside the halls of academia, his legacy clung stubbornly to the edges of public memory. Pamphlets circulated in moralist circles, calling for stricter codes of conduct at sea. What separates man from beast, they asked. If we excuse cannibalism once, where does it end? The story became cautionary. Parents warned their sons. Captains gave speeches to their crews. Sermons invoked the tale as proof of God's judgment. But still, no one asked what kind of boy Richard had been. He had liked oranges. That much his. Sister remembered. He used to peel them in one long spiral and wear the skin like a bracelet. He was afraid of horses, but pretended not to be. He'd once carved his initials into the church pew and blamed it on a cousin. He kissed a girl behind the blacksmith shop and told no one. He sang badly, but with heart. He had a laugh that made others laugh. None of that made it into the trial. Years passed. One journalist, a young man with a moral conscience and a flair for narrative, decided to write a book about the case. He called it The Boy in the Sea. It was part history, part biography, part elegy. He interviewed sailors, historians, and even visited the Parker home. Richard's mother refused to speak, but she gave him a photograph. It was the only one they had. Richard was standing on a dock, hands in his pockets, squinting into the sun. The wind had caught his hair. He looked older than 17, proud, weather-hardened, but his eyes were soft. When the book was published, it sold modestly. It was praised for its humanity, for its refusal to sensationalize. It asked questions. The trial hadn't. Who gets to survive? Who decides? What does it mean to live with the choices we make? Dudley read the book. He bought it anonymously in a town where no one knew his face. He read it in one sitting, alone in his small room, with the lamp burning low. When he reached the final chapter, a fictional imagining of Richard's last thoughts, he wept so hard he thought his ribs might crack. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he took the book to the cliffs and burned it page by page, not out of anger, but because it felt like confession, like penance. Stevens never read the book. He had moved inland, far from the sea. He lived a quiet life, unmarried, known to neighbors as a man who enjoyed gardening and long walks. He kept a Bible by his bed and never spoke of his time as a sailor. When asked, he said he'd once worked aboard ships but gave it up after a bad voyage. In his will, he left a donation to a charity for orphaned boys. He died in sleep, at peace, with no known family by his side. Dudley lived longer, into his 70s. His body grew frail, but his mind remained sharp. He rarely spoke of the past, but sometimes, when the wind howled just right through the cracks in the shutters, he would say the boy's name under his breath, not with fear, not with guilt, with reverence. Richard. It was not enough. It would never be enough, but it was what he had. In the end, the sea took him too. He was found in his bed one morning, the window open, salt in the air. In his drawer was the journal he had kept all those years. Inside, on the final page, written in shaky hand, I lived. I remembered. I tried. They buried him on a quiet hill, not far from the coast. A plain stone marked the grave. No grand epitaph, just a name and 2 dates. Some who visited never knew the story. Others knew all too well. The sea still whispers, not with words, with wind, with waves, with silence. It tells a story that is never quite finished, a story of hunger and mercy, of fear and fate, of choices made in the void between life and death. And in that story, a boy is always there, looking up at the sky, waiting for rain, believing even at the end that someone might come. Years later, long after the names Dudley, Stevens, and Parker had faded from public consciousness, the wreck of the Mignonette remained a tale sailors told in hushed voices, usually late at night, usually after a few drinks, when the fire crackled low and the wind scraped the sides of the wooden hull. But it wasn't just sailors who remembered. Among those who could never let go of the story was a young barrister named Eliza Rowan. She'd first heard the name Richard Parker in law school. It was a mandatory case in the curriculum, Osh v. Dudley and Stevens, a foundational ruling on necessity and murder. Most of her classmates had treated it like just another lecture, but something about it stuck with her. The idea that law could forbid what instinct demanded, that survival could still be criminal. Eliza had always believed law was about justice. But this case raised questions no textbook could answer. She'd gone home that night and read everything she could find. The trial transcripts, old newspaper clippings, essays, even the out-of-print biography, The Boy and the Sea. Deeper she dug, the more the case haunted her. The verdict had been clear. Necessity was no defense to murder. But was it justice? The boy was dying. The men were starving. The sea was indifferent. What would she have done in their place? These weren't questions of law. They were questions of humanity. After graduating, Eliza took a position with a London legal firm, but never forgot the case. On weekends, she wrote, not for court, not for publication, just for herself. Her notebook filled with fragmented thoughts, moral quandaries, imagined dialogues between the men, reflections on justice in a world where the line between right and wrong often blurred. Then one day, in a used bookshop near the Thames, she came across something unexpected. A journal, faded leather cover, brittle pages handwritten. The label inside read, "Property of T. Dudley, 1884. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The bookseller, an elderly man with thick glasses, said he'd found it mixed in with a crate of naval memoirs bought at auction. He hadn't read it, said the writing was too small for his eyes, but he let her purchase it for next to nothing. She spent the next 3 days in a quiet haze, reading it cover to cover. The words were raw, uneven, torn between justification and guilt. Dudley had written not just about the voyage, but about his nightmares, his guilt, his shame, and, most heartbreakingly, his memories of the boy. He asked for water, one entry read. He asked for his mother. Eliza found herself weeping over the pages. In her professional world, victims and perpetrators were clearly defined. But here, in this story, those roles tangled and bled into each other. The boy had been a victim, that much was certain, but the men, were they murderers, or were they simply the final casualties of a world without mercy? She needed answers. That summer, Eliza took leave from the firm and travelled to Southampton, then to Cornwall, tracing the fading trail of the Mignonette. Survivors, archives, old ship logs, graves, names etched into stone. Every village held a sliver of the past, a whisper, a shadow. In a churchyard near the coast, she found the Parker family plot, 4 names on a moss-covered stone. At the bottom, nearly worn away, was a 5th, Richard Parker, 1867-1884. Lost, but not forgotten. Eliza knelt there for a long time. What haunted her most was not just that the boy had died. It was that he had died in silence, alone, out at sea, afraid. His final thoughts known only to the men who had taken them with them. And then she had an idea. She would write a play. Not a legal analysis, not a book, a story, a human one. One that gave voice to the boy. One that showed not just the facts, but the fear, the desperation, the impossible choices. For months she wrote feverishly. She imagined Richard Parker's childhood, his laughter, his rebellion, his dreams of faraway shores. She gave him lines he never got to say. She gave him a voice. She imagined Dudley, not as a villain, but as a man unraveling at the edge of sanity, trying to hold on to command when the universe had stopped following rules. She portrayed Stevens as the quiet moral center, torn between loyalty, logic, and horror. And in the final scene, she gave Parker the last word. On opening night, the theater was packed. Law students, historians, local townspeople, descendants of sailors. One elderly woman who claimed tearfully to be a distant relative of Stevens. When the lights dimmed and the play began, silence fell. The audience watched as the boat drifted under a stark white light, as hunger gnawed at the men, as hope dissolved, as Parker, played by a wide-eyed young actor, looked up at the stars and whispered the name of a sister who never got to say goodbye. By the time the final monologue ended, the theater was in tears. Boy stood at the edge of the stage and said in quiet defiance, "I was not a law. I was not a symbol. I was not a choice. I was a boy, and I was afraid." The applause was thunderous, but it wasn't triumph Eliza felt. It was peace. For the first time in over a century, someone had told the story from the middle, not from the judgment. Not from the books, but from the beating, breaking human heart at its center. After the show, an old man approached her. "I was in law school in the 50s, he said, eyes bright. "We studied the case, of course. Never thought I'd cry over it, but you made him real." That night, Eliza walked to the harbor alone. The tide was out. The air was sharp with salt. She sat on a bench facing the sea and listened. The waves, gentle now, whispered as they always had. But this time, she didn't just hear the story of men in desperation. She heard a boy, laughing, singing, dreaming of oranges. And at last, someone was listening. The sea, once a stage for unthinkable decisions, had long since quieted. But while the waves forgot, people did not. The press had faded, the courtrooms had emptied, but the ghosts remained. Among those left behind was Sarah Parker, Richard's elder sister. She had been just 19 when he disappeared, the kind of age where the world still shimmered with promise. Richard had wanted to see that world. He had been restless, full of stories about ships and oceans, about adventure and distant skies. She still remembered the day he left. Their mother had sewn a patch into the sleeve of his only coat. Their father had said nothing at the door, only clapped him on the shoulder, pride and worry warring in his expression. Richard had promised to write, to send coins when he could. "I'll come back with a beard," he'd grinned, trying to sound grown. But he never came back. Sarah had spent Months afterward, watching the sea, she'd walk down to the harbour every morning, a letter crumpled in her pocket that she never got to send. She asked every ship's captain if they'd seen the mignonette. Most hadn't even heard of it. The rest offered vague condolences, eyes already drifting back to their charts. Then the news came, not all at once, but in fragments. A letter from London, a name in the paper. Cannibalism at sea, murder in the lifeboat. The words hit her like ice water. For days she could not speak. Her mother fell into silence. Her father aged in weeks. What crushed them most was not just the death, but the way it was told. Richard wasn't mourned. He was dissected. The papers spoke of legal precedent and maritime ethics, of utilitarian sacrifice, of duty and desperation. But no one asked what kind of boy he was. No one wrote about the way he used to hum when nervous, how he'd carved birds out of driftwood, how he once snuck food from his own plate to feed a stray dog. To the world, he had become a symbol, a curiosity, a legal footnote. Sarah couldn't bear it. She stopped reading the news. When her neighbours offered condolences, she nodded in silence. There was no comfort in their words, no place to set down the grief that refused to fade. But grief has strange tides, and in time it changed shape. 10 years passed, then 15. The world moved on. The case was cemented in British law, but Sarah, now older, quieter, found her anger had settled into something else. She wanted the truth preserved, not just in textbooks, but in hearts. And so she began to write, not for courts, not for academics, for her brother. Her first pages were clumsy, filled with tears, but over time her voice steadied. She wrote what she remembered, Richard's dreams, his songs, the day he stole an apple from the market and couldn't stop apologizing for it for days. Then she wrote what she imagined, his final days, not the horror, but the silence before it, the salt on his lips, the ache in his bones, the way the sea must have looked under the weight of starvation. She did not write of the killing. She couldn't, but she wrote everything around it. She wanted people to know the boy, not the case. By candlelight, over many winters, she penned what would eventually become a small book, just 60 pages, hand-bound, titled The Last Voyage of Richard Parker. At first, she printed only a few copies, shared with local clergy and family. But word spread. A professor from Exeter requested a copy, then a student from Oxford. Eventually, a small press in Bristol offered to publish it properly. Sarah was hesitant. She wasn't trying to become an author. She just wanted her brother's memory to have warmth. But the publisher promised her it would be handled with care. No sensationalism, no judgment, just truth, in the plain, unvarnished language of love. The book was published in 1899, and though it never became a bestseller, it reached the right eyes. A young barrister named Theodore Marshall read it while preparing a lecture on necessity in British law. He was so moved by it that he revised his lecture entirely. Instead of focusing solely on the case's legal implications, he spoke of Parker, the person. He told his audience about the carved birds, the stolen apple, the dreams of oranges under foreign sun. He was not a principal, Marshall said. He was a boy. The shift was subtle, but lasting. Law schools still taught the case, but with added nuance. Ethics professors began assigning Sarah's book alongside the trial records. Even some judges quietly passed copies to new clerks, reminding them that behind every ruling there is blood. Meanwhile, Sarah lived out her final years in a small cottage near the sea. She never married. She walked the cliffs often, stopping to watch the waves, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. To neighbors, she was a kind, quiet figure. Children brought her wildflowers. Fishermen offered her fresh cod. She always accepted with a nod, eyes still distant. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1912, with the manuscript beside her bed. At her funeral, a small group gathered. Few knew the full story, but among the mourners was a young sailor who had once heard her read aloud at the church. He had kept the words with him through storms and dark nights at sea. To him, the tale wasn't about cannibalism. It was about memory, about humanity, about the line between survival and sacrifice. He placed a small carving, a bird just like the ones Parker used to whittle, on her grave, and said softly, "You didn't let him vanish." Years later, a historian researching maritime tragedies would rediscover Sarah's book in a dusty archive. It would be republished in a modern edition, with annotations and commentary. The preface would read, "Before he was a case, he was a brother. This is not a legal account, it is a eulogy carried on the tide." And so the boy lived on, not in courtrooms, but in hearts, not as a symbol, but as a soul. And every time someone read his sister's words, the sea gave up one more secret. The truth that even in the darkest moments, love remembers what the world forgets. In the years after Sarah Parker's quiet death, her small book did not vanish. It drifted through time, sometimes in silence, sometimes with sudden bursts of light, like a message in a bottle that kept washing ashore when someone needed it most. In 1923, a boy named Elias Davenport found a worn copy of The Last Voyage of Richard Parker in a second-hand bookstore on the Thames. He was 13, bored, killing time while his father conducted business across the street. The title caught his eye. He opened it, began reading, and didn't stop until his father called him, irritated, from the doorway. That book changed him. Elias was not a sailor's son. His family dealt in coal and contracts, not ropes and rigging, but something about the story lodged inside him, not just the tragedy, but the quiet way it had been told. No anger, no spectacle, just love and sorrow and the ache of memory. He carried that copy with him for years, through war, through loss, through joy. When his own son was born decades later, Elias handed it to him without ceremony. "Read this," he said. "It's a story people forget, but they shouldn't." And so the story lived, passed not as a historical account, but as a kind of inheritance. By the 1970s, a small group of scholars had begun to take a deeper interest in the Parker case, not as a legal precedent, but as a psychological and ethical puzzle. They gathered at symposiums, wrote papers, and always returned to one question: what do we become when survival costs more than we can pay? It wasn't just the killing that haunted them. It was the silence after, the way Dudley and Stevens had. Returned to England, tried to live normal lives, the way the court had condemned the act but not fully the men. The way the public had moved on so quickly. One professor, Dr. Margaret Albright, was particularly drawn to the human contradictions in the case. She taught at Cambridge, lectured in dusty halls lined with portraits of stoic men, but her voice carried with it the tremor of conscience. She assigned The Last Voyage of Richard Parker in her class, not as supplemental reading, but as central text. History, she told her students, is not measured only in dates and decisions. It is measured in mercy, in how long we allow a name to linger before forgetting it. She began every semester by reading aloud from the passage where Sarah Parker described her brother as a boy who walked into the sea with wonder in his eyes and salt on his lips. Some students cried. Not all understood, but the ones who did, really did, carried it with them into courts, into classrooms, into the marrow of who they became. In 1986, a filmmaker named Callum Rhodes began work on a documentary that would take years to finish. It was not flashy. There were no dramatized scenes, no swelling orchestral soundtracks, just interviews, archival footage, and the steady voice of the sea. He named the project Salt and Blood. The final shot was simple, a view of the Atlantic, grey and endless. Then a single carved wooden bird floating, fade to black. In the credits, he thanked Sarah Parker by name. The film didn't win awards, but it found a home in classrooms and independent cinemas, broadcast late at night on public stations. Letters poured in. A retired sailor from Nova Scotia wrote, "I've lost 3 men to the sea." This story reminded me they aren't lost, just waiting to be remembered. A therapist in Liverpool wrote, "I showed it to my patients. We all cried, not because it was horrific, but because it was human." As time pressed forward, something remarkable happened. The Richard Parker case, once a mere footnote in legal textbooks, began to take on new life. A museum in Southampton, long dedicated to maritime history, commissioned a special exhibit titled "The Limits of Survival." At its center, the lifeboat. Not the actual one, of course, that had long since vanished, but a reconstruction, built to scale, detailed down to every plank. Visitors stepped inside and felt the narrowness, the claustrophobia, the terrible intimacy of 4 souls trapped between the sky and the deep. Next to it, behind glass, the boy's face. A sketch, drawn by a contemporary artist based on descriptions, and family likenesses, young, soft-eyed, wind-blown, not yet gaunt, not yet afraid. Just a boy who believed the world was still a place he could explore without being consumed by it. The exhibit's curator, Amira Khan, had debated long and hard over what to place beside that sketch. Trial documents, newspaper clippings, eyewitness accounts. In the end, she chose something else. A single quote from Sarah's book, printed in looping handwriting on the wall behind the lifeboat. He looked at the sea and saw a story. We looked at him and saw a meal. For that, I will never forgive the world. People stood for long minutes in front of that wall. Some cried. Some closed their eyes. Some looked out the window toward the harbor, where modern ships still sailed, oblivious to the quiet boy frozen in time, just yards away, and still the story spread. In 2012, a young poet named Keenan Lowe released a chapbook titled "The Orange Was Not Enough." It was filled with quiet elegies, aching with salt and sky. The final piece, Letter from the Lifeboat, imagined Parker's thoughts in the final days. "I dream of trees that whisper, of bread I'll never taste. I forgive you already. Not because I should, but because I am too tired to carry hate." The collection won no awards, but it went viral online. Teenagers on TikTok read it aloud over ambient ocean sounds. Artists drew Parker as a saint of lost boys. Musicians sampled the lines into electronic tracks titled 17 at Sea and Forgive Me, Child. And then, as always, things quieted again. But the silence felt different this time. Not absence, respect, a kind of cultural stillness that said, "We see you now, not as a victim, not as a case, but as a boy who didn't get to grow old, who should have lived to laugh, to love, to eat oranges under a summer sun without fear." In that silence, there was peace. In that peace, remembrance. And somewhere, in the deep places of the world, where the ocean no longer screams but whispers, the story floated, gently like driftwood, toward those who still needed to hear it. The sea has a memory, even when people do not. In the small Cornish village of Polruan, just above the cliffs where gulls wheel and children throw stones into the tide, a boy named Isaac Trewin found something unusual wedged between two rocks. It was a small object, worn smooth by years of salt and time, a piece of wood no larger than a hand, carefully carved. Not driftwood exactly, it had intention, shape, a figure, a bird. He turned it over, curious. There were faint lines etched into the wings, deliberate and symmetrical. The eyes had been hollowed just slightly, giving the impression of softness, of life caught in stillness. The beak was chipped, but the form remained graceful. He ran to show his grandmother. She turned it in her fingers with a look Isaac didn't understand. She didn't speak right away. Then, quietly, she whispered, "That's a story I haven't thought about in 50 years. She told him the basics, the boy, the lifeboat, the hunger, but Isaac wanted more. He was 9 years old, with the kind of curiosity that refused to leave questions unanswered. So he did what few children his age still bothered to do. He went to the library. There, in the back, under maritime history, he found an old book with a brittle cover, The Last Voyage of Richard Parker. He read it cover to cover in a single sitting. When his grandmother picked him up, he didn't speak until they were halfway home. Then he simply said, "Why did they let him die?" She didn't answer. Some questions shouldn't have answers, only echoes. But Isaac didn't stop there. Over the next few years, he collected everything he could find about the story. His bedroom became a shrine of sorts. Maps, hand-drawn lifeboats, clippings printed from dusty corners of the internet. He asked his teachers if he could do his final project on the case. They nodded vaguely, not realizing the depths he intended to explore. By 15, Isaac had written 3 essays and 1 short play based on the boy's final days. He submitted it to a regional competition. It won, not because it was polished. There were clumsy phrases, overwrought emotions, but because it was raw and real and honest. A theatre director in Truro read it and invited Isaac to help adapt it for the stage. The result was a spare, haunting production. Just 4 actors, a lifeboat built from slatted wood and shadows, no costumes, no elaborate set, just breath, light and silence. The boy who played Richard Parker was only 16, with a delicate frame and a voice that trembled in the quiet moments. On opening night, when he whispered, "I'm so hungry I dream of rain," there was not a single cough in the theatre, only stillness, and then tears. The play toured for a year, quietly but steadily. School halls, small venues, a makeshift stage. In a dockyard warehouse. Every audience reacted the same way, not with outrage, but reverence. Not with pity, but recognition. People saw something of themselves in the story, the parts that feared death, that dread choices, that love those who disappear without goodbye. And in every performance a single bird was placed at the front of the stage, a nod to the carving Isaac had found. He never learned where it came from. Maybe it was Sarah's. Maybe it had fallen from a pocket, drifted for decades, and waited for the right hands to find it again. Or maybe it didn't matter, because the story had found new breath, not in courtrooms, not in textbooks, but in voices. In 2020, a woman named Myra D'Souza began hosting a podcast called Tides of Mercy. She was a maritime historian with a soft voice and a talent for threading emotion into fact. Her third season was devoted entirely to the Parker case, not just the trial but the ripples. She interviewed descendants, sailors, psychologists, poets. She tracked down the actor who had once played Parker on stage. Now 32, he still carried a copy of Isaac's script. "Sometimes I still dream I'm in the boat," he admitted, not afraid, just waiting. In one episode, Mera read excerpts from Sarah's book over the sound of lapping water and distant thunder. Her listeners wrote in by the thousands. One said, "I listened to it while driving along the coast. I had to pull over. I just cried." Another wrote, "I was that boy, not in the sea, but in the silence, in the being forgotten." What was once a single tragedy had become a kind of mirror. It reflected the lonely, the unheard, the sacrificed. It reminded people that even brief lives leave long shadows. By 2024, plans were underway for a permanent memorial, not in London, not in a courtroom, but by the sea. The village of Lizard Point, the closest landfall to where the Mignonette had gone down, agreed to host it. A small overlook was cleared on the cliffside, framed by wind-blown grasses and the cries of gulls. At its center, a sculpture, not grand, not towering, a boy seated, carved from stone, arms around his knees, head resting lightly to the side. Eyes closed, not in death, but in sleep, peaceful. The sea behind him, endless. In his lap, a bird, and beside him, etched in the rock, "Let the world remember not how he died, but how he was loved." At the unveiling, people came from all over. A few sailors, many strangers. Some had only heard the podcast, others had seen the play. A few were academics who had followed the case their whole careers. Isaac was there too. Now 26, he stood beside the statue quietly, holding the same carved bird he'd found so many years ago. He placed it at the foot of the stone boy, then stepped back. No speech, no announcement, just memory. And in the breeze, in the hush that followed, it felt, as it always had, that the story wasn't really over. It had simply found its home. Years stretch and bend, but some stories hold steady, carving themselves into the bedrock of memory like waves shaping cliffs. The story of Richard Parker, the lifeboat, and the harrowing choice of survival has echoed through time. Its waves, touching the lives of many who never knew the men themselves. Descendants of the crew, scattered across continents and generations, found their own ways to reckon with the past. One was Lydia Thompson, great-granddaughter of Thomas Dudley. Raised in a quiet farmhouse outside Southampton, Lydia grew up with whispered family tales, some proud, some ashamed. Unlike many, she had never known her great-grandfather personally. He died long before she was born, leaving behind only court, transcripts, and an uneasy legacy. When Lydia first discovered the last voyage of Richard Parker in a local archive during university, she was struck by its humanity. The book did not cast Dudley and Stevens as villains, nor did it paint Parker as merely a victim. It revealed fractured souls caught in an impossible situation, bound by desperate decisions and devastating consequences. This understanding gave Lydia a sense of peace. She organized gatherings for descendants of all involved parties, fostering dialogue rarely attempted before. These meetings were not about blame, but about healing, about acknowledging pain, regret, and resilience. At one gathering, a distant relative of Richard Parker shared a letter written by Sarah Parker, never before public. in which she expressed a wish for forgiveness, not for the act, but for the silence that followed. Lydia read the letter aloud, and the room fell into a reverent hush. It was a moment that transcended history and law. It was raw, human connection. Meanwhile, in academic circles, the Parker case became a focal point for discussions about morality in extremis, what philosophers called the ethics of survival. Legal scholars debated whether the ruling against Dudley and Stevens had prevented or exacerbated suffering in similar cases since. Psychologists studied the long-term trauma endured by survivors of extreme situations, noting how societal judgment often added layers of isolation. The case reminded them that human decisions are rarely clear-cut when life itself is on the line. The public, too, continued grappling with these questions, especially as media portrayals grew more nuanced. Documentaries, plays, podcasts, they all forced audiences to confront uncomfortable truths about desperation, morality, and the fragility of civilization's rules. One recurring theme emerged: compassion, in an age when so much is binary, right or wrong, guilty or innocent. The story of the lifeboat resisted easy answers. It demanded empathy for all involved, a recognition of complexity and grief. This shifting perspective influenced how similar cases were approached. Courts began considering psychological duress more seriously. The Parker precedent, once rigid, became a starting point for nuanced debate rather than an end point. In the small seaside town where Sarah Parker had lived her quiet life, a new school program was launched, teaching children not only history, but the importance of kindness in the face of hardship. Teachers read passages from her book aloud, encouraging students to think deeply about choice, sacrifice, and forgiveness. The community named a library room in her honor, the Sarah Parker Reading Room, filled with stories about survival, resilience, and human spirit. It became a sanctuary for those wrestling with their own trials, a place where the boy in the lifeboat was never forgotten. Through these ripples, the story lived on, not as a grim warning, but as a beacon. And in a modern courtroom, in London, a judge once referenced the Parker case in sentencing a man accused of a desperate crime. The judge spoke not only of law, but of mercy, reminding all present that the weight of human suffering is not always easily measured. Back on the coast, where the memorial to the boy and the carved bird stood overlooking the restless sea, visitors still came to sit quietly, reflect, and listen to the ocean's ancient song. The story had traveled far, from the darkest hours of human desperation to a place where memory became a call to kindness. Hello, and thank you for staying with me through this journey, a story of the sea, survival, and the haunting echoes of a boy named Richard Parker. As we come to the close of this tale, it's important to pause and reflect on what it truly means to remember. The ocean does not merely erase, it holds. Beneath its waves lie stories of courage and heartbreak, decisions made in desperation, and the fragile humanity that binds us all. Richard's story, born from tragedy, has transcended time, not just as a grim reminder of what was lost, but as a testament to resilience, compassion, and the complex choices we face when life's boundaries dissolve. Over the years, many have sought to make sense of what happened on that tiny lifeboat. Scholars, artists, families, and strangers alike. They've wrestled with questions about morality, law, and the nature of mercy. But beyond these debates lies something deeper, the recognition that survival sometimes demands unbearable sacrifices, and that forgiveness is a gift we give not only to others, but also to ourselves. The memorial at Lizard Point stands as a quiet beacon, an invitation to remember not just how a boy died, but how he was loved, and how his story continues to ripple through generations. In our modern world, where judgment can be swift and mercy rare, the story of Richard Parker reminds us to look beyond the surface, to see people in their full complexity, to hold space for pain and hope together. As you carry this story with you, I invite you to think about the lives we don't often hear, those shaped by hardship and silence, and to remember that in every desperate choice there is a human heart beating beneath. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for honoring this story with your time. If you found value in this journey, please subscribe to the channel to explore more stories that uncover the hidden truths of our shared past. There's so much more to learn, and together we can keep these memories alive. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and never forget the power of compassion.